that what Cain did is he brought the offering as he was required. Abel brought the offering as he was required, but Abel brought the best, the first things. Cain did not. And because of that, if you really look deep into this conflict, it says, "Why are you angry? Why is your countenance falling?" The Lord asked Cain in verse 6. And then he says, "If you do well, will not your countenance be lifted up?" So notice that sin, he says, crouches at the door when our countenance has fallen. So how do we bring that up? How do we bring that up? Because it's when our countenance is down, the essence of envy, that sin creeps in. And this is why it's so self-deceptive. Do you see how we brought it? Well, hello, everybody, and welcome to the Salty Pastor Podcast. It is a podcast designed to help you think for yourself. It's a thinking person's podcast for people who believe that fluff is not enough. They want to understand the intellectual, the rational, reasonable foundation of their faith. Why belief in God and in Christ Jesus has been tested for thousands of years and found to be the most rational, reasonable definition of the human experience, who God is and the reality in which we live and what Christ has done for us. So if you believe that you want to think for yourself, know what you believe and why you believe it, and have a conviction that not only is your faith real, but it has been tested time and time again and come up smelling like a rose every time, then the Salty Pastor Podcast is for you. We're here to get a little bit deeper. We're here to get a little bit more nuanced. We're here to dig deep and understand not only what faith really is, but the actual nature of faith and why the Apostle John told us in his letter that the victory that overcomes the world is actually our faith. So, with that in mind, we are zooming ahead here on the Salty Pastor. Now, it's also important for you to understand that as a pastor for 39 years, I am now retired as a pastor of a church. And so this has been in development for some time, and it's finally come to fruition. And the primary reason why this is happening is because my wife, Kim, has been diagnosed with a very aggressive form of MS, and it has some of the rare symptoms that come from it, and her condition has continued to worsen. And so I'm a primary caretaker. I need to be with her. We generally, not always, but generally are scheduling around-the-clock care for her right now, and I'm a major part of that. And so I just wasn't able to do all of the leadership and management and vision casting, all the things that are necessary, shepherding and pastoring and discipling, if you're going to lead a church and keep it healthy and strong. Church needs great leadership in today's world, and I didn't feel I was able to provide that as well as I would like to. So I retired from that to focus on my wife and take care of her, but I also am able now to do the Salty Pastor. It's my only pursuit right now, and it is able to be done from home in my home studio, and my wife is really close by, and I can continue to be there for her. So I'm asking you if you are disaffected right now. Maybe you find yourself between churches. You've moved from one state to another or across town, and you haven't found that place yet. Well, the Salty Pastor can be your pastor during this time. Maybe you were hurt in church, and you have difficulty finding a place to really connect and grow. Then let the Salty Pastor be your church for this period of time until you heal up and the Lord leads you to where you need to be. My goal is not to supplant the local church at all, but my goal is to pastor and minister to all those who are in between, who are seeking, particularly those who are skeptical, those who want more for their faith. They want to go deeper. They also like to laugh and have a good time. Well, guess what? That makes you a perfect candidate to become a part of the Salty Pastor crew and join the Salty Pastor Network. Now, what we're at right now is we are in a series called the 7 Deadly Emotions. Now, the whole point of this series was basically based on Evagrius Ponticus and his 7 deadly sins: anger, envy, gluttony, greed, lust, pride, and sloth, laziness, or the desire to take the easy road all the time. And he wrote these because the early church, the first century church over a couple hundred years, had adopted Aristotle's 7 virtues. Aristotle's 7 virtues were trust, compassion, courage, justice, wisdom, temperance, and hope. And the early church, these really resonated with the early church. And the goal of Christianity in the first few centuries, it's really interesting, is that it wasn't set out to be like a separate religion in the way the cultures thought of religion at that time. It was basically a truth proposition, and the goal was to pursue this truth. And so early on, the early church fathers adopted kind of a motto, and that was all truth is God's truth. And what they were trying to say is, well, if we know it to be true, and we can affirm that it is true at some level, then it obviously comes from God, and we need to figure out how or why. So anyway, that's why they would adopt, various true statements from great thinkers that at the time existed before Christ had even walked the face of the earth. So Evagrius said, hey, if these are great virtues, then what do we have to watch out to is their counterparts. Those were the 7 deadly sins. And even though there's not like a list of 7 deadly sins in the Bible, Evagrius just said, hey, watch out for these because they basically counteract the greatest virtues that you might pursue in love, the ones that reflect the biblical fruits of the Spirit in Galatians chapter 5. And so I thought one of the most important things we could do in today's world, because no longer do we think with a logical or rational process of thinking, which is what the difference is about virtues. You think virtuously when you use a form of logic that is rational in its orientation. Today, what we do in American society is predominantly think with emotional logic. And that is that we are driven by our emotions. We let them draw our conclusions. And then because we tend to be highly educated people or access to lots of information, then we rationalize the conclusion we've come to from an emotional standpoint. And therefore, I thought, well, let's look at the emotions that drive so many human beings in America today and even in the lives of Christians. That is anger, fear and anxiety, despair or sadness, boredom or slothfulness, guilt and shame. We did last week. And today we are on the 6th one, and that is envy. So today we're going to talk about the deadly emotion of envy. Now, what exactly is envy? Let's kind of define it and then kind of look at, well, why is it so deadly as an emotion? Well, first and foremost, Webster says that envy is a painful or resentful awareness of an advantage enjoyed by another, joined with a desire to possess that same advantage. So it kind of has a little bit of two natures to it, right? First of all, it is an awareness of an advantage or something that another person has, okay? So it could be, wow, that person has a nicer car than me. Wow, that person has a nicer physique than I do. That person has more talent than I do. That person has more money or is more successful or is has a better education or a better job or a better position or whatever may be the case. It's an awareness of an advantage that somebody else has. So it's like, not only do they have a nicer car, look at what that car does for them. Not only do they have a nicer job or position, but look at the perks that come with that job or position. Not only do they have a better house and a better neighborhood, better friends, better physique, look at all of the privileges or benefits that brings them. So you are aware of an advantage and everything that comes with it that is being enjoyed by another person. It also is coupled with the second part, and that is you start to desire or wish that you could possess that same advantage. It's almost like I wish I was that successful or that talented, or I had that job, or I had that position, or I had that physical attractiveness, or I had that, whatever, fill in the blank. And so you say, I want to have that. Now, what's really interesting is when these two things come together, you have envy, and the first thing you realize is it is a painful awareness. So it brings pain. And I think the reason envy causes hurt in your life is because it's coupled a little bit with shame, the thing we talked about last week. And that is this sense within each person, young men in particular, is the insecurity of, am I enough? Like, I don't know if I'm enough. For women, it would be, am I really lovable? Will someone really, truly love me? And so I think this ties into the spiritual thirst that human beings have. So that's why when we see somebody else doing better than us because of a position or a skill or a talent or a success or a recognition, it's painful to us. We wonder, well, why can that be me? And it comes from a thirst of the soul that believes if I had that, I would be more happy, or I would be more joyful, or I would be more whole. I would be more at peace. Life would be so much better. But what's really interesting is that little trick of the mind is, I think, where the deception starts and why envy becomes so deadly. And what it does is it causes you to focus your pain and your suffering that comes from an insecurity, right? When you have envy, and you focus it on the catalyst of your pain instead of the cause of your pain. What do I mean by that? Well, okay, we just described it this way, is because we often as human beings have this deep-seated question within our soul. For women, it's, am I lovable? Am I really loved? And for men, it's, am I enough? Am I sufficient? Am I a man? And because we have that question, we naturally doubt, being a strong affirmative yes to those questions, right? The reason they keep coming up is because we have a little bit of doubt, and so it breeds a little bit of shame within us. Well, I'm not enough. Or, well, if I'll never be loved. If I was more talented and better looking and had an athlete's body, I'd be more loved, or whatever may be the case. So so we have pain and suffering there. And so what we do is we look at this other person, we compare ourselves to that person, we desire what they have, and then instead of recognizing the cause of where our pain comes from, what envy feeds off of, we get angry or mad or jealous of the catalyst, meaning the person who has it. So this is where hatred and betrayal and antagonism and all of these things come from within the lives of people, even Christians all the time, is because of the issue of envy. And don't forget, envy is the basis of the 10th commandment in the Bible. And that is, do not covet another person's, it says all these different things. And, well, why would you covet them? Because you are hurt and envy is entered into the heart. It was obviously a problem because it's one of the top 10 and it's on the list. So let's dig into why it's so deadly now. Now that we kind of have a working definition, let's dig into why it's so deadly. And this is where we need to really do some Bible study, okay? And the first one is is that we have to realize, because envy causes you to focus on the catalyst or the thing you think your pain comes from, the thing that you're comparing yourself to, instead of the cause of where it comes from, it is prime real estate for self-deception. This envy and the self-deception that we experience is the kind of the driving force of our destructive behavior towards other people, towards ourselves, and then we rationalize it. We focus out of it. And this is the oldest story in the Bible. For instance, if you start with Genesis, right at the beginning here, it starts with good old-fashioned Cain and Abel in chapter 4. And this story is ancient. It's the first story, and it bespeaks of the fallen nature of human beings as they attempt to relate to God. Because if you remember, the whole story of Cain and Abel revolved around the bringing of a offering to God. All right? And it says, verse 3, so it came about in the course of time that Cain brought an offering to the Lord of the fruit of the ground. And Abel, on his part, also brought of the firstlings of his flock and of their fat portions. And the Lord had regard for Abel and for his offering. But for Cain and his offering he had no regard. So Cain became angry, and his countenance fell. What does he do? He finds his brother Abel, and he kills him. Now, what's really interesting is, if you want to understand why there are different religions in the world, then read this story. If you want to understand why there are different categories of Christianity, Roman Catholic, Eastern Orthodox, and Protestant, then read this story. If you want to know why there are so many denominations, then read this story. This message of envy sticks out to me more than anything else in this story. Here's what I mean. Cain killed Abel because Abel had a position, he had a standard, he had an accolade from God that Cain did not. And this is why envy is such a deadly emotion. When it takes root in your heart, it always brings death. The only question is, what will it ultimately kill? The other thing that I think is important to understand in this story of Cain and Abel is this, is that it shows how deceptive envy can be. The whole notion of being self-deceptive is illustrated because instead of asking God a very simple question, hey God, you had regard for Abel's, but you didn't have regard for mine. Why? You think about it. That's all he had to do is ask a simple question. God is interacting. Look, God even has a conversation with Cain, right? In verse 6, it says, the Lord said to Cain, why are you angry, and why is your countenance fallen? So it's really interesting, is he has a conversation with Cain, and then in verse 7, he says, if you do well, will not your countenance be lifted up? And if you do not do well, sin is crouching at the door, and its desire is for you, but you must master it. So Cain told Abel his brother, and it came about when they were in the field that Cain rose up against Abel his brother and killed him. So Cain has a conversation with God before he kills his brother Abel. And what's interesting is all he had to do in his conversation with God is simply say, God, why did you regard Abel's and not mine? But he didn't do that. Now, some theologians say, well, it's implicit in the scholar understanding of how Hebrew worked as a language in the ancient history of this culture and so forth. And the reason why can be found in verse 4. It says, Abel brought the firstlings of his flock and of their fat portions. So he brought the first fruits, the best fruits. It says, in the course of time, Cain brought an offering to the Lord of the fruit of the ground. So the Hebrew basically implies that what Cain did is he brought the offering as he was required. Abel brought the offering as he was required, but Abel brought the best, the first things. Cain did not. And because of that, if you really look deep into this conflict, it says, "Why are you angry? Why is your countenance falling?" The Lord asked Cain in verse 6. And then he says, "If you do well, will not your countenance be lifted up?" So notice that sin, he says, crouches at the door when our countenance has fallen. So how do we bring that up? How do we bring that up? Because it's when our countenance is down, the essence of envy, that sin creeps in. And this is why it's so self-deceptive. Do you see how we've brought the dots together? Is that when our countenance falls, when we compare ourselves to somebody else, we see them having a benefit that we don't have, then we get angry or upset at them, and we want to tear them down. We want to deride them. And this is very, very common. Men out in the marketplace or on the sporting field or wherever, they will do things in order to tear somebody else down or to hinder them. Men will cheat other men in business. Men will gaslight other men. They will do things, right? Women are different. Research says this, is that what women do is that they will destroy your reputation. They will accuse you or say things that aren't true. This is particularly prevalent between females in various societies. For instance, females will undermine the reputation of other females, and they will say things that are derogatory. They will categorize or use very judgmental language. They will gossip about them extensively. Now, men do things, women talk about the things. That's kind of what the research says when it comes to these things. And so that's why envy is such a bad thing. So envy is so deceptive because the cause of our pain is ourselves, right? But it's our self-deception that focuses our energy to deal with envy on the catalyst or the person. And so we'll either do things or say things in order to hurt that other person, which when you think about it is really so unfair, because that person didn't actually do anything to you at all. And yet there is such animosity and desire to hurt that other person. And that's why there's so much evil in this world. That's why there's so much devastation. That's why people do crappy things to one another all the time, even in churches, even Christians, even in families. They do it all the time. And so it starts very, very early on. But, I mean, this is a story that goes throughout the whole Bible. Look at chapter 21 of the book of Genesis. Sarah, who is the wife of Abraham, wanted a child forever, couldn't have one. So instead of trusting the Lord, she had her servant Hagar sleep with her husband Abraham. He gets Hagar pregnant, and then she gives birth to Ishmael, right? And then in chapter 21, verse 9, it says that this is after Sarah then did get pregnant and give birth to Isaac. And so it's right after Isaac is born. As soon as he's born, it says, Sarah saw the son of Hagar, the Egyptian, whom she had borne to Abraham, mocking. Therefore she said to Abraham, drive out this maid and her son, for the son of this maid shall not be an heir with my son Isaac. So you see, it's like, he has position right now. I don't want him to have any position at all. So it was envy that drove Hagar out into the wilderness after she had born Ishmael. At this time, Ishmael was about 14 years old. And so, it's really kind of strange. But if you think about it, we're still paying for that envy between Sarah and Hagar today, because Islam tracks its heritage spiritually back to Abraham as their father through Ishmael. So it's really kind of interesting. Then if you look a little bit further, you could go down into Genesis chapter 29, and you can look at, Genesis has a lot to say about human nature, right? And so it's really interesting because you look at Rachel and Leah. These were the two wives, of Jacob, and Jacob loved Rachel. But he had married Leah first because his father-in-law had deceived him, Laban. And so just look at Leah. She's like, I'm the ugly sister that he didn't want. And what he does is, but she could have babies, and she just had child after child after child. Rachel, whom he loved dearly, couldn't give him a child. And so Leah was very envious of Rachel, and Rachel was very envious of Leah. Tim Keller wrote a book called Counterfeit Gods, and he said Leah had become bitter about the fact that her husband did not love her but loved her sister. And so every time she produced another son, she reasoned, and this is what it says in verse 32 through 34 of chapter 29. It says, Leah conceived and bore a son and named him Reuben, for she said, because the Lord has seen my affliction, surely now my husband will love me. So she thought, the more children I give him, he'll finally love me. I'll be seen. I'll be validated like Rachel. And of course, Rachel, on the other hand, was like, she has all the children and I have none. You go down, this whole thing of envy was, look at Joseph's brothers. You remember all the sons of Jacob, who then became known as Israel. It's really amazing. But if you look at verse chapter 37, these sons, it says that Israel, or Jacob, loved Joseph more than the other brothers. And it says this, now Israel loved Joseph. This is chapter 37 of the book of Genesis, verse 3. Now Israel loved Joseph more than any of his other sons. Wow, that's not good at all. And then he goes on to say, he made an ornate robe for him. And when his brothers saw that their father loved him more than any of them, they hated him and could not speak a kind word to him. Now, notice what they did is that instead of acknowledging the cause of their pain, we don't feel our father loves us, and we feel that denigrates us, and that's hard. Instead of dealing with the cause of their pain, what they did is they hated the catalyst, and that was, well, Joseph is loved, it's all his fault. And this is just not an Old Testament theme, what envy does to people. If you go over to Luke in chapter 15, there is the parable of the prodigal son. You remember this story is that there were two brothers, and the youngest one says, give me my inheritance. The father does. He goes off to a foreign land. He squanders it all, wastes it, and then he's starving to death, and he comes home with his tail between his legs, and he's just basically telling this story of the lost son coming home and the father's joy. The father then celebrates by killing the fatted calf and giving him a robe, puts a ring back on his finger. And it's really interesting because if you look at verse 28, what did this do to the older brother who stayed and was always obedient to the father? It says, the older son became angry, and he was not willing to go into the party or celebration. And his father came out and began asking him, begging him to come in. And he answered and said to his father, look, for so many years I have been serving you. I have never neglected a command of yours, and yet you have never given me a kid that I might be merry with my friends. But when this son of yours, he doesn't even call him his brother, who has devoured your wealth with harlots, you killed the fatted calf for him. And that is so interesting because what drove that response? Envy. We could also look at Judas Iscariot, who betrayed Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane. We could look at the story of Paul and Peter in Galatians chapter 2, verse 11. And it says, well, when Peter came to Antioch, Paul says, I told him to his face that I was against what he was doing because he was clearly wrong. He used to eat with the Gentiles, but when certain men from a group sent by James came, he began to draw back and separate himself from the Gentiles. And so This is all about, where does all this envy come from? Well, if you actually really want to know, you have to look at the temptation of Satan in Genesis, right? Chapter 2 and 3, and the fall of Satan recorded by the prophet Isaiah in chapter 14. And what you will see is that Satan wanted God's position. In verse 13, it says, Satan says, I will go up to the heavens. I'll raise my throne above the stars of God. So he was envious of God and wanted to tear him down. So these biblical principles are clear. Number one, envy is deadly. It always kills. Number two, envy is the basis of the 10th commandment. Do not covet. Don't compare yourself to anybody else and want what they have, whether it be their possessions, their position, their looks, their charm, their talents, their skill set. Never, ever covet any of that stuff. Envy, according to these biblical stories, lives in the space of comparison. That's right. You compare yourself with somebody else, and it's in that comparison where you really see envy take root. Therefore, envy always relies on all of the qualities in you that allow you to compare yourself to others. And what are those qualities? Have you ever thought about it? Have you ever, how I always say in the Salty Pastor, it's not often what you're thinking, but how you're thinking about it that makes a difference. Have you ever asked yourself, what causes a person to compare themselves with somebody else? Where does that come from? In the heart, in the soul, in the mind, what's the psychological makeup of envy and that's derived in comparison? Why do we compare ourselves? Is it just simply, as scientific rationalists say, a part of the evolutionary ingrained into your DNA or some craziness like that? Or is there another reason? Well, first and foremost, in order to compare yourself with somebody else, you need what is called transcendence. That is the capacity to see life through another person's eyes. So first and foremost, transcendence, which is one of the most spiritual things about you, right? It's where love and compassion and hope and mercy and kindness come from. Guess what? Is self-transcendence is where it is derived from. Second of all, it requires desire or ambition. There's nothing wrong with godly desire. There's nothing wrong with ambition. There's nothing wrong with wanting to be a better person, a more successful person. You want to grow. You want to sharpen your skill set. You want to maximize your talents and so forth. You want to be more productive. You want to leave the world a better place. These are wonderful godly ambitions, right? However, it also requires judgment. So not only do you have transcendence, which is a spiritual thing, not only do you have God, it requires ambition, it also requires judgment. So when you compare yourself, you need all of these things, but you also need to make a judgment. And that's where it starts to go off the track, because that's when you have your rational mind kicks in and goes, well, if I had that, so you're making a judgment, then my life would be like this. So envy relies, this is what's so interesting about envy. It's so deadly because it relies on all of the wonderful qualities that make you a spiritual person with a soul. But in the end, it kills everything in you that is spiritual. So let's leave it at there. And we're going to pick up on Thursday as we apply this to real life. Now, please remember that the Salty Pastor is now 100% independent of any and all other ministries. We stand alone on our own 2 feet. So we need your support. We need your monthly, regular support. We'd love to have you come. And if you feel that this Salty Pastor podcast is valuable, if you're in between churches or you're connecting with my ministry over the years and you've been blessed by it, then would you please go to the website? And we would love to have you click on that donate button. It will go directly to our giving portal. And so love to have you sign up for just become a monthly supporter. Every bit helps in the Salty Pastor. And we appreciate all of you who are supporting us now. And we pray that you will continue to do so in the future. So remember, when it comes to living life, you should always be able to think for yourself.